The secret of the silent cabin, infamous for its ghostly silence and cold blood-curdling tales, there existed a small town in desolate forests, in the heart of Massachusetts, by the name of Darkwood. And several miles from town, deep inside the woods, stood an old, dingy cabin. Locals described it as the silent cabin. But no one had ever dared utter it out loud why it came to be known that way. It was whispered that anyone who ventured too close to the cabin either vanished without a trace or returned broken, their minds shattered beyond repair. A dark legend, the story of the silent cabin, was rooted in a century-old tragedy. They said that 100 years ago, a mysterious man named Mr. Graves lived there. Mr. Graves was an alchemist who lived as a recluse, obsessed with the powers of darkness. Strange lights and unnatural sounds came from the cabin night after night. The townsfolk avoided the place, too afraid to interfere with whatever sinister experiments Mr. Graves was conducting. One night, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the woods, followed by a bright flash of light that was as blinding as it was intense. The next morning, the villagers found the cabin burned to cinders, with the charred remains of Mr. Graves inside. From that day on, the silent cabin was never quite the same. Lights flickered inside it at night, disembodied voices whispered through the trees, and shadowy figures were seen to prowl around the perimeter of the cabin. Edward Green's obsession. Enter Edward Green, a 35-year-old writer known for his skepticism of supernatural tales. He thrived on debunking urban legends and dismissed the stories about the silent cabin as mere folklore. "You're all just superstitious," Edward told his friend Mark one evening. "If there's a secret in that cabin, I'll uncover it and prove it's nothing but nonsense." Mark tried to warn him, "Edward, don't be foolish. Many have gone to that place and never returned. It's not worth your curiosity." But Edward would not budge. "I shall go tonight," he said, "and I will show you that there is nothing to be afraid of." Journey to the cabin. On a chill autumn night, Edward packed a lantern, a camera, and a notebook and set off toward the forest. The air grew colder as he entered the dense woods, with an unnatural silence enveloping the trees. His footsteps crunched against the fallen leaves, but the sound felt hollow, as though the forest itself was swallowing every noise. From time to time, Edward thought he caught the faintest whispers, as of voices on the wind. Then he would stop and look about, but nobody was there. "It's just the wind," he growled to himself, clenching on the lantern tighter. The cabin appears. After what seemed to be an eternity, he finally came upon the cabin, a crouching box with its roof fallen in, moss and vines covering its sides. Still, through breaks in the wood, a very slight, fluttering light showed from within. Edward hesitated, his heart beating against his chest. Summoning his courage, he took a deep breath and stepped inside the creaking door. Inside the cabin, the interior of the cabin was colder than the outside forest. It stank of decay. Weird symbols scratched upon the walls seemed to glow with faint light in the dim room. In the middle of the room, there was a small wooden table, on top of which sat an ancient chest marred with scratches and dried blood. Edward approached the chest, his hands shaking. He opened the lid and found two things inside: a blood-stained dagger and an old, yellowed letter. The letter read, "You who enter here have sealed your fate. The silent cabin does not forgive. It does not forget. Turn back now, if you can." A sudden change. Just as Edward was finishing, a deafening bang slammed the door shut behind him. The symbols on the walls started to shine brighter, their rhythm like a heartbeat. The air grew heavy, and a low guttural growl echoed through the room. Edward spun around, clutching the dagger, but the room was empty. Or so he thought. From the corner of the cabin, something was finally beginning to emerge, a tall, shapeless figure with glowing red eyes. The shadow began to move towards him, exuding an icy coldness. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, the voice echoing in Edward's mind. A desperate fight. Edward tried to back away, but the shadow was quicker. It lunged at him and wrapped him in darkness. Panting, Edward swung the dagger wildly, but it only cut through the shadow as if it were smoke. The shadow laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You cannot hurt me," he said. "You are part of the cabin now." But the blade suddenly lit up, flailing against its wielder without any warning, and his out-of-control hand stabbed it deep into his chest. As Edward dropped onto the cold hard earth, the shadow looming over him was the last image burned into his fading vision, red eyes ablaze brighter than before. The aftermath. The next morning, Edward's friend Mark gathered a few villagers to search for his whereabouts. His car was found parked close to the edge of the woods, but there was no sign of Edward. When they came upon the silent cabin, his notebook lay on the ground. The last line in his handwriting read, "The cabin is alive. It watches. It waits. And it takes." None was courageous enough to go inside the cabin to look for him. Weeks passed with no sign, and Edward Green was declared missing, presumed dead. The new shadow. But all was not so well. Several months later, a hunter passing that way swore that he saw the shadow in the doorways, one with blood-red eyes staring back. Of course he turned the other way, running, never to stop, and told what he saw to the residents of the towns. It was then they realized the truth: Edward hadn't vanished. He had become the silent cabin's curse, just as all those others before him did. Moral: some mysteries were better left unsolved. Today, the silent cabin remains standing, and grimly waits for its next visitor.